Students, today we are going to study our third chapter in the supplementary reader, the reader of books. Let's begin. By the time she was there, Matilda had taught herself to read by studying newspapers and magazines that lay around the house. At the age of 4, she could read fast and well, and she naturally began hankering after books. Here, hankering means feeling a strong desire to have or do something. So, in these sentences itself, we can see that she is interested in reading. The only book in their home was something called Easy Cooking, belonging to her mother, and when she had read it from cover to cover and learned all the recipes by heart, she decided she wanted something more interesting. Daddy, she said, do you think you could buy me a book? A book? Said her father. Whatever do you want a book for? To read, Daddy. What's wrong with the telly? For heaven's sake. For heaven's sake means an expression of anger or irritation here. The telly means television. We have got a lovely telly, here television itself called telly, with a 12-inch screen, and now you come asking for a book. You are getting spoiled, my girl. That afternoon, Matilda set out all by herself to walk down to the public library in the village. When she arrived, she introduced herself to the librarian, Mrs. Phillips. She asked if she might sit a while and read a books. Mrs. Phillips, slightly taken aback at the arrival of such a tiny girl, unaccompanied by a parent, nevertheless told her she was very welcome. Nevertheless means even so, or although she was surprised. Where are the children's books, please? Matilda asked. They are over there on those lower shelves, Mrs. Phillips told her. Would you like me to help you find a nice one with lots of picture in it? So in these sentences, we can see Matilda had taught herself to read by the time she was 3. She taught herself to read by studying newspapers and magazines that lay around the house. At the age of 4, she could read fast and well. And we know that the children's book may be kept on the lower shelves so that small children who are not very tall can reach them easily. Moving on. No, thank you, Matilda said. I am sure I can manage. From then on, every afternoon, Matilda would toddle down to the library. The walk took only 10 minutes, and this allowed her 2 glorious hours sitting quietly by herself in a cozy corner, devouring one book after another. Devouring means reading quickly and eagerly. When she had read every single children's book in the place, she started wandering around in search of something else. Mrs. Phillips, here Mrs. Phillips means the librarian itself, who had been watching her with fascination for the past few weeks, now got up from her desk and went over to her. Can I help you, Matilda? She asked. I am wondering what to read next. Matilda said, I have finished all the children's books. You mean you have looked at the picture? Yes, but I have read the books as well. So do you know why does Mrs. Phillips think that Matilda has only looked at the picture? So here we can see Mrs. Phillips thinks that Matilda has only looked at the picture because she cannot believe that Matilda has already finished reading all the children's books. Anyway, moving on, Mrs. Phillips looked down at Matilda from her great height, and Matilda looked right back up at her. I thought something were very poor, Matilda said, but others were lovely. I liked The Secret Garden best of all. Secret Garden is the book, children's book. It was full of mystery. The mystery of the room behind the closed door and mystery of the garden behind the big wall. Mrs. Philip was stunned. Exactly how old are you, Matilda? She asked. 4 years and 3 months, Matilda said. Mrs. Phillips was more stunned than ever, but she had the sense not to show it. What sort of a book would you like to read next? She asked. Matilda said, I would like a really good one that grown ups read. A famous one. I don't know any names. Mrs. Phillips looked along the shelves, taking her time. She didn't quite know what to bring out. How, she asked herself, does one choose a famous grown up book for a 4-year old girl? Try this, she said at last. It's very famous and very good. If it's too long for you, just let me know and I will find something shorter and a bit easier. Great Expectations, Matilda Read by Charles Dickens. I would love to try it. I must be mad, Mrs. Phillips told herself, but Matilda, she said, of course you may try it. So, would you say Mrs. Phillips is excited to recommend this book to Matilda and why? So, here in this paragraph, we can see Great Expectation by Charles Dickens. So, that book suggested by Mrs. Phillips to Matilda. Matilda is very much short girl also. You know that 4-year old. Mrs. Phillips is excited to recommend this book to Matilda because she is already surprised and impressed by Matilda's reading and wants to see how she will like the famous books by Dickens. Moving on, over the next few afternoons, Mrs. Phillips could hardly take her eyes from the small girl sitting for hour after hour in the big armchair at the far end of the room with the book on her lap. It was necessary to rest it on the lap because it was too heavy for her to hold up, which meant she had to sit leaning forward in order to read, and a strange sight it was, this tiny dark haired person sitting there with the feet now ever near touching the floor, totally absorbed by the spell of magic that Dickens, the great storyteller, had woven with his words. The only movement from the reader was the lifting of the hand every now and then to turn over a page, and Mrs. Phillips always felt sad when the time came for her to cross the floor and say, It's 10 to 7, Matilda. During the first week of Matilda's visit, Mrs. Phillips had said to her, Does your mother walk you down here every day and then take you home? My mother goes to Aylesbury every afternoon. Aylesbury is a place, maybe she has work there. Matilda had said, She doesn't know I come here. So without the permission of parents, she is regularly coming to library, public library. But that's surely not right, Mrs. Phillips said. I think you had better ask her. I had rather not, Matilda said. She doesn't encourage reading books, nor does my father. But what do they expect you do every afternoon in an empty house? Just to watch the telly. They are saying just to watch television only. I see. Mrs. Phillips was concerned about the child's safety on the walk through the fairly busy village, high street, and the crossing of the road, but she decided not to interfere. So here, what activity do your family members encourage you to do? So they will always say to you, read and study only, isn't it? They will not encourage you to see television. But here, she is very much small than you. That's why her parents says that see television only. Within a week, Matilda had finished Great Expectations, which in that edition contained 411 pages. I loved it, she said to Mrs. Phillips. Has Mr. Dickens written any others? A great number, said the astounded Mrs. Phillips. Astounded here means very surprised. Shall I choose you another? Over the next 6 months, under Mrs. Phillips' watchful and compassionate eye, Matilda read the following books. These are the books read by Matilda. First one, Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Death of the Uber Bills by Thomas Harley, Gone to Earth by Mary Webb, Kim by Rudyard Kipling, The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. These are the famous books read by our Matilda, small girl. Oh, it's not over. Moving on. The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. The Grapes of Warmth by John Steinbeck. The Good Companions by J.B. Priestley. Brighton Rock by Graham Greene. Animal Farm by George Orwell. So moving on, it was a formidable. Formidable means looking very grand but difficult list. And by now, Mrs. Phillips was filled with wonder and excitement, but it was probably a good thing that she did not allow herself to be completely carried away by it all. Almost anyone else witnessing the achievements of the small child would have been tempted to make a great fuss and shout the news all over the village and beyond, but not so Mrs. Phillips. She was someone who maintained or minded her own business and had long since discovered it was seldom worthwhile. Seldom worthwhile means good value of the time, money, or energy spent useful. So she is usefully managing her time. Who? Matilda. To interfere with the other people's children. Anyway, she didn't made a big news. Who? Mrs. Phillips didn't made a big news. So what is meant by here phrase minded her own business means? It means that she did not try to get involved in other people's lives and problems and kept her opinions to herself. Moving on, Mr. Hemingway says a lot of things I don't understand, Matilda said to her, especially about men and women. But I loved it all the same, the way he tells it. I feel I am right there on the spot watching it all happen. A fine writer will always make you feel that, Mrs. Phillips said. And don't worry about the bits you can't understand. Sit back and allow the words to wash around you like music. So here, allow the words to wash around you means enjoy the flow of the words without going into too many details. I will. Did you know, Mrs. Phillips said, that public libraries like this allow you to borrow books and take them home? I don't know that, Matilda said. Could I do it? Of course, Mrs. Phillips said. When you have chosen the book you want, bring it to me so I can make a note of it and it's yours for 2 weeks. You can make or you can take more than one if you wish. From then on, Matilda would visit the library only once a week in order to take out new books and return the old ones. Her own small bedroom now became her reading room, and there she would sit and read most afternoons, often with a mug of hot chocolate beside her. The books transported her into a new world and introduced her to amazing people who living exciting lives. She went on olden day sailing ships with Joseph Comte. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and to India with Rudyard Kipling. She traveled all over the world while sitting in her little room in an English village. It is written by an excerpt from Matilda by Roald Dahl. So, in short, we can see that the speaker has shown Matilda to be a very talented and a devoted reader, isn't it? Matilda began by teaching herself to read when she was little as 3. She read the only books she could find at her home from cover to cover, and then we seen that even though her parents did not encourage reading, she set out all by herself to visit the library. Her reading time there has been described as glorious. She finished all the children's books in a few weeks and moved on to more grown up books. Finally, we seen that she borrowed books from the library and read them in little room. often with a mug of hot chocolate. So after that, we could see the speaker describes the scenes of Matilda reading in the library or in her little room as quiet and cozy. Very much sensible reading she is reading there. Matilda appreciated the books much more than a child her age is expected to. We know that she loved reading more than anything as she read the only book in her home, a cooking book, from cover to cover, and then began hankering after more interesting books. She walked all by herself to the library so that she could read books. So she managed to go outside without the permission of parents. And she kept reading famous but grown up books, even though she did not understand